Steady hands, nurse. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 47 minutes before Commander James Rivera's heart stopped beating. Cedar Creek Medical's night shift hums under fluorescent lights that turn everything the color of old bones. Antiseptic and floor wax. Burnt coffee from the nurse's station sitting in unwashed mug since the day shift abandoned them at 5 o'clock. Margaret Walsh moves through the corridors with her medication cart, grey hair pulled into a bun so tight it pulls her forehead smooth, her hand steady as surgical lasers as she checks for lines and adjusts monitor settings. She has been here 6 months. Not long enough to make friends. Long enough for the young nurses to start asking her questions instead of asking Dr. Whitfield. Her scrubs are navy blue, generic. Her badge says Lem Walsh, RN in block letters, nothing more. In her locker downstairs, wrapped in a grocery bag that smells like plastic and time, sit a pair of combat boots. The leather is worn brown, almost tan in places where the sun caught them for years. Fallujah dust clings to the creases near the laces, dust she has tried to wash away a dozen times and cannot quite remove. Some things don't come clean. The fluorescent lights flicker. She does not look up. Margaret enters the ICU at 2,145 hours. Room for 12, post-op cardiac monitoring, standard vitals check. The monitors beep in their steady rhythm, a language she has spoken for longer than she has been nobody. Longer than she has been just a nurse. Her fingers move across the keyboard entering vitals without hesitation, each number precise, each movement economical. No wasted motion. No hesitation. The kind of efficiency that takes years to develop or military training to install. Dr. Whitfield watches her from the medication room. She can feel his eyes the way you feel a sniper's lens settle on your chest. Not a medical concern. A territorial threat. He has been the chief of surgery at Cedar Creek for 8 years. Before that, Johns Hopkins for 5. He comes from money, the kind that shows in his watch, a $18,000 Rolex with a face the color of storm clouds, and in the way he moves through the hospital like he owns the tiles beneath his feet. This week alone, Margaret has questioned his post-op protocol on 2 separate cases. She asked about drain placement on a thoracic closure. She suggested a different antibiotic regimen for a patient showing signs of resistance. Both times, she was right. Both times, the younger surgical residents heard her and started listening to her instead of him. He does not appreciate being corrected by someone whose badge says RN. Margaret finishes her documentation and turns from the station. Dr. Whitfield stands in the corridor, blocking her path. He does not step aside. She walks around him, her shoulder nearly brushing his arm, and continues toward the cafeteria. It is 2,247 hours. She has 43 minutes before the next medication round. The cafeteria is nearly empty. The fluorescent lights buzz their endless mechanical song. Margaret collects a tray, salad, water, a roll that tastes like nothing, and moves toward a table in the corner. She walks past a group of 5 surgical residents eating dinner together. They are laughing about something, their voices easy, their shoulders relaxed in the way people relax when they do not feel hunted. Dr. Whitfield appears beside her before she can sit down. Steady hands, nurse. Margaret turns toward him. She does not flinch. She does not blink. Her jaw clenches, a single line of muscle tightening for less than a second, and then her face is neutral as drywall. Whitfield raises his hand and pushes her cafeteria tray. Not hard, he is not brave enough to actually assault her, but hard enough. The tray tips. The salad slides across the edge of the plate. Water spills. The roll tumbles across the floor and stops against a chair leg. Food spreads across the tile like an accident nobody planned. The 5 surgical residents stop laughing. Whitfield smirks. His teeth are too white, the kind that come from cosmetic dentistry and the kind of money that makes problems disappear. Steady hands, he says again, louder now, performing for the residents. You'll need them here. He walks away before she can respond. Margaret stands motionless for 3 seconds. Her hands do not shake. Her face does not flush red. Her breathing remains even, controlled, the breathing of someone who has breathed through worse. She bends down, picks up the fallen roll, and places it on the tray. She collects the scattered salad with her bare hand and a napkin. Nobody helps. Nobody speaks. The residents watch her like she is a performance they do not understand. She throws the destroyed tray in the trash and walks out of the cafeteria. That is the first test. Whitfield is probing her, the way a predator probes an unfamiliar animal. Will she cry? Will she quit? Will she crumble? He has made a public bet with the surgical residents that she will quit within a week. Margaret Walsh, quiet and efficient and military precise in ways that do not match her resume. By Friday, he thinks, she will be gone. By Friday, she will have saved 17 lives. Margaret returns to ICU at 2,300 hours. The night deepens around Cedar Creek Medical like water rising. The city outside the windows becomes darker and smaller, Portland reduced to scattered lights and the distant sound of traffic. The hospital becomes its own ecosystem, beeping monitors, ventilators wheeze, the soft padding of nurse shoes on tile. Room 412's monitor shows a steady rhythm. Sinus rhythm. Normal, strong, predictable. At 2,247 hours exactly, they bring Commander James Rivera through the ER doors. He arrives on a gurney, already intubated, his body wrapped in military precision. Bandages cover his chest in geometric patterns. A dressing on his left shoulder shows blood that has only partially soaked through. The bleeding has slowed, which means either the bleeding has stopped or the patient has very little blood left to bleed. His eyes are closed. His skin has the pale, waxy quality of someone who has given a significant portion of his fluids to the ground instead of keeping them in his veins. Margaret sees him from the medication station. She does not recognize him. Not yet. The face is swollen with trauma and medication. The body is wrapped and destroyed in ways that do not immediately resolve into a specific memory. What she registers first is the precision of his bandaging, military field dressing, the kind taught to combat medics, applied by someone who knew what they were doing. Applied by someone trained. The ER trauma team moves him into a monitored bed. Admitting information follows on a digital chart. Commander James Rivera, 41, Naval Special Operations Command, admitted with blast-related injuries sustained in Fallujah, Jolin District, 34 days ago. Transferred from the VA for cardiac and pulmonary monitoring. Possible cardiac tamponade, possible tension pneumothorax, waiting on imaging to confirm. Margaret reads the admission note without appearing to read it. Fallujah. Jolin District. 34 days ago she was wearing a uniform. 34 days ago she was not Margaret Walsh. 34 days ago she was something else, something the government needed, something that required her hands to be capable of things that nurses' hands did not normally do. She turns away from the terminal and continues her rounds. Her breathing remains steady. Her hands do not shake. The trembling is not fear. It is restraint. Dr. Whitfield appears at the nursing station at 2,256 hours, coffee in one hand, his expression the satisfied expression of someone who has successfully humiliated a subordinate and is pleased with himself. He does not acknowledge Margaret. He scrolls through the admissions, sees Rivera's name, and his face does something interesting, a slight tightening around the eyes, a pause before he continues scrolling. He recognizes something. A name. A rank. A warning. Make sure ICU room 414 has continuous cardiac monitoring, he says to one of the younger nurses. No gaps. I want someone in that room every 15 minutes. It is not a request. It is a command. It is the voice he uses when he is afraid of something. Margaret continues documenting vitals in room 412, her movements economical and precise. The patient here is stable, recovering well, his monitors showing the pleasant rhythm of someone whose body is healing itself. She checks the good flow, no infiltration, and adjusts the medication drip by 0.3 milliliters. Precision. Everything precision. By 23:15 hours, she has moved through her assigned patients and is helping a younger nurse named Sarah with post-operative vitals in room for 15. Sarah is good, attentive, careful, asking questions. The kind of nurse who will be excellent in 5 years, assuming the hospital does not burn the competence out of her first. "Did you see that guy they admitted?" Sarah asks, checking the patient's chest tube output. "Looked like he went through a war." "Probably did," Margaret says. She does not elaborate. She does not mention the dress pattern of the bandages or the field dressing technique or the 1,000 other details that tell her exactly what kind of weapon caused exactly what kind of injury. She continues documenting. Sarah keeps talking. "Dr. Whitfield looked weird when that guy came in. Like, scared weird. I've never seen him scared." Margaret does not respond. She finishes the vital signs and hands off the chart. Sarah leaves to log the data. Margaret remains in the room for another 15 seconds, listening to the monitors, listening to the patient's breathing, listening to the sound of the hospital settling into its night rhythm. At 2,342 hours, the monitor in room 414 shows the first irregular beat. It is subtle. A single ectopic beat. A single irregular spike in the otherwise perfect rhythm. Nothing that should alarm anyone. Nothing that should suggest anything is wrong. Except Margaret was trained to notice what normal people miss. She was trained to read bodies the way other people read books, to understand what the absence of sound means, what a single irregular heartbeat implies. She is at the medication station, entering vitals from room 413, when she hears the rhythm change. She does not hear it. She feels it. The way you feel the change in air pressure before a storm. The way you feel a threat you cannot yet identify. She stands up and walks toward room 414. The monitor shows a heart rate of 114. Too fast. The rhythm is becoming more irregular now, the irregular beats coming faster, waves of chaos beginning to fragment the steady electrical signal. She looks at the monitor screen and sees what is starting to happen. She sees it before the other nurses notice. She sees it before the alarms begin to sound. And then, because she is just a nurse, because she is nobody, because she is just a woman in navy scrubs moving quietly through a hospital at nearly midnight on a Thursday, she walks back to the station and makes a note in his chart. She documents what she sees. Clear, precise, clinical. Increasing ectopic activity. Recommend cardiology consult. Nobody listens to the quiet nurse. Nobody pays attention to the woman whose badge says she is nobody special. But she documents it anyway. She documents it because she has spent 23 years being the person who notices what kills people, and she is not about to stop now, even if she is wearing a stolen identity and a civilian disguise and a pair of combat boots wrapped in a plastic bag in a locker on the basement level of a hospital in Portland, Oregon. The monitor in room 414 continues its irregular dance. The machine does not know that the man inside is a warrior. The monitor does not care that he survived blast injuries and blood loss and the kind of trauma that turns most bodies into statistics. All the monitor knows is that his heart is beginning to fail, and nobody in this hospital, except for one very quiet nurse, understands what is about to happen. The break room smelled like burnt coffee and the particular staleness of a space where hope goes to die on the night shift. Dr. Whitfield gathered the surgical residents like a general assembling troops, his voice loud enough to carry into the hallway, intentionally loud. Margaret knew this. She could hear him from the medication cart 2 rooms away, heard every word meant for her ears as much as for theirs. "I'll give her a week," Whitfield said, his voice that particular timbre of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Maybe 10 days if she's stubborn. Grey hair over there won't last a month on night shift. She's got that look, the exhausted idealist who realizes this job will chew her up and spit her into early retirement." He pulled out his wallet with the casual confidence of someone who'd never experienced the sensation of losing. $100 bill slapped against the break room table like a gunshot. 3 residents contributed 20s each, laughing the way junior staff laughed when they believed themselves safely aligned with power. Margaret walked past the doorway carrying a medication tray, 2 syringes of heparin, 3 vials of cardiac glycoside, a 10 cubic centimeter syringe of sodium chloride marked for Commander Rivera's 4. Her face remained unchanged, the same mask of professional neutrality she'd worn through 6 months at Cedar Creek. But her jaw tightened. Not visibly to anyone watching closely. Only someone who understood the language of restraint would have noticed the almost imperceptible clench of muscle at her temple. She continued down the corridor without breaking stride. The next 2 weeks unfolded with the kind of relentless precision that only cruelty fueled by institutional power could achieve. Whitfield had recognized something in Margaret that threatened him, not her credentials, which were flawless, but something underneath them. A steadiness. A competence that didn't require validation or hierarchy to exist. The younger residents had started asking her questions instead of asking him. During shift changes, they consulted her notes. One of them, a third-year named Chen, had actually asked her opinion on a medication adjustment instead of waiting for Whitfield's rounds. This was unforgivable to a man whose entire identity rested on being the smartest person in the room. So he escalated. The cafeteria incident occurred at 0300 hours on a Tuesday, that hollow part of the night when the hospital seemed to exist in a separate dimension. Margaret sat alone at a corner table, eating methodically, not because she was hungry but because the body required fuel and she'd learned long ago not to negotiate with her own physiology. She was thinking about Commander Rivera's latest cardiac panel when Whitfield approached, moving with the deliberate casualness of a predator. "Excuse me, doctor," she said quietly, beginning to stand so he could pass. He stepped forward instead of back. The tray tipped. Not dramatically, Margaret's reflexes caught it, attempted the correction, but Whitfield's proximity made it impossible. Coffee splashed across the linoleum in a dark constellation. Yogurt container tumbled. A sandwich scattered. 18 night shift staff suddenly became very interested in their own meals or their phones or the wall directly in front of them. "Steady hands, nurse," Whitfield said, his smile thin as a scalpel. "Thought you had better control than that." The room went dead silent. Not the comfortable silence of concentration but the suffocating silence of witnessing something that required acknowledgement nobody wanted to give. Margaret's hands remained at her sides, perfectly still. Her fingers didn't curl into fists. Her shoulders didn't tense. She simply looked at the mess on the floor, the spreading dark liquid, the way it caught the fluorescent light, and then she knelt. Her movements were methodical, deliberate, the way someone might perform a ritual they performed 10,000 times before. She picked up the tray. Wiped the floor with napkins from her pocket, methodical swipe after swipe, until the linoleum gleamed again. She didn't look at Whitfield. Didn't speak. Didn't allow her eyes to meet anyone else's gaze. She stood, disposed of the mess in the bin, and walked back to the nurse's station as though nothing had happened. The nickname started the next day. Grey hair during shift report. Grey hair, can you get me the med list, in front of patients trying to recover from surgery? Grey hair's probably missing her book club, in emails to staff, his words like breadcrumbs he was laying down to see who would follow. Some did. Others stopped speaking to Margaret entirely, a social death by association that was often worse than direct confrontation. One nurse, Sarah, who'd been friendly during the first weeks, suddenly redirected all questions to Whitfield instead. Margaret observed this shift without reaction and began working more independently, which was exactly what Whitfield wanted: isolation. The chart-throwing happened during morning rounds, 3 weeks into this campaign of incremental psychological dismantling. Dr. Whitfield moved through the cardiac wing with his entourage of residents and interns, reviewing overnight notes. He reached Commander Rivera's room and pulled the chart from the binder with mechanical efficiency. There are Margaret's handwriting in the margins. Questions about the medication dosage. Not insubordination, exactly. Just questions. The kind of professional inquiry that a competent nurse might ask when something didn't align with standard protocol. But Whitfield read it as a direct challenge to his authority, which meant it was unforgivable. He ripped the chart from the binder. The paper tore slightly, the spine bending backward. He walked to the nurse's station and threw it at Margaret's feet, not dropping it but actually throwing it, the pages fanning, some sliding across the linoleum toward the medication room. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice carrying the particular venom of a man performing dominance. "And next time, let the doctors do the thinking." 6 nurses and 2 residents watched. One resident, a 4th year named Patterson, actually stepped back slightly, creating distance between himself and the epicenter of this moment, as though proximity to Margaret's humiliation might be contagious. Margaret's face showed nothing. Not a flush rising into her neck, not a tremor in her lower lip, not the kind of tears that come from shame and hurt. Just the calm that came from having already survived worse, much worse. She bent down, retrieved the chart, smoothed the pages carefully, checking for damage, making sure no notes were smudged or lost. She stood, holding the chart against her chest like something that mattered. "Yes, doctor," she said quietly. That was all. 2 words. But something in the way she said them, something in the absolute flatness of her voice, the complete absence of deference or apology, seemed to register with Whitfield as a threat. His jaw tightened slightly. He turned and continued his rounds, but the ease had gone out of his movements. Margaret returned to Commander Rivera's room and checked his vitals with her usual precision. Cardiac monitor showing 78 beats per minute, steady rhythm. Blood pressure 118/72. Temperature normal. All the vital signs that meant the body was still fighting, still present, still engaged with the business of remaining alive. But there was something else on the monitor. A slight irregularity in the T wave, the smallest deviation in the electrical pattern that made the heart contract. It was almost nothing. Most people would miss it. Most doctors would miss it. But Margaret had spent years learning to read the language of cardiac distress in all its dialects and accents, and she saw it clearly. She made a note in the chart, not a question this time, just an observation, and ensured it would be visible during the next rounds. Someone would have to address it. Someone would have to take it seriously, because ignoring a T-wave deviation in a SEAL who'd been through what Commander Rivera had been through was the kind of mistake that got people killed. What happened next would prove that her instincts were correct. What happened next would require everything she'd spent 23 years learning. What happened next would change everything. But for now, there was only the monitor's steady beep, the soft hiss of the oxygen supply, and Margaret's hands, steady, precise, unmarked by the weight of Whitfield's campaign against her, continuing their work. The electrical room on Cedar Creek Medical's 3rd floor ignited at exactly 0200 hours. Old wiring. Overloaded circuits. Nobody heard it happen, just the sudden hiss of arcing electricity, then nothing but silence and heat. By 0203, smoke was already creeping through the ventilation system like something alive, spreading through the corridors faster than anyone had anticipated. The building's fire suppression system kicked in, but the smoke didn't care. It moved. It spread. It found every gap, every crack, every path toward the occupied floors where 73 patients were sleeping, unaware that the night shift was about to become a battle. The first alarm sounded at 0205. Not a test. Not a drill. The intercom crackled with a voice that tried to sound calm and failed. Code red, all staff to evacuation stations. This is not a drill. In the administrative offices on the 2nd floor, doctors and office personnel began moving toward the exits with the careful bureaucratic precision of people who'd never actually experienced an emergency. They filed. They ordered. They called 911 and activated their protocols. Their movements were correct. Their thinking was not. Margaret was in the ICU when the smoke reached her ward. She didn't have to think about what to do. Her body already knew. She was moving before her conscious mind caught up, her hands reading the room's temperature, her nose catching the acrid copper tang of burning insulation, her ears picking up the way the ventilation system's pitch had changed, higher, faster, panicked. The smoke billowed in through the overhead vents like water filling a sinking ship. 3 nurses stood frozen near the desk. 2 residents argued about whether protocol required administrator approval to move patients. Nobody was moving. Nobody was helping. The clock was running. Margaret's voice cut through the paralysis. Not a request. Not excuse me or please. Her tone dropped 2 octaves, the voice she'd buried for 6 months, the voice of someone who'd commanded Marines under fire in Fallujah, under conditions that made a hospital fire look like a kitchen mishap. All patients on this ward, prepare for evacuation. Now. The word now didn't sound like a suggestion. The 3 frozen nurses moved without asking questions. They moved like they'd trained their entire lives for exactly this moment. Room 312, Room 314, Room 316, 15-minute mobility window maximum. Anyone on portable oxygen stays with me. Anyone on wall oxygen gets disconnected and bagged. She was already moving, her hands on the first patient, a 70-year-old woman with pneumonia, helping her into a sitting position. Can you walk? The woman nodded. Then move. Stairwell C, down to ground level, away from the building. Don't stop. Don't wait. Go. The resident, a 26-year-old named Morrison who'd been in the same hospital for 11 days, tried to argue protocol. We should wait for administration to authorize. Margaret was already past him, moving to the next room, already assessing, already coordinating. Administration isn't in cardiac arrest. Move the patients or stand aside. He stood aside. The ICU became a cascade of coordinated movement. Margaret's hands became a blur, disconnecting monitors, removing 4 lines with the precision of someone who'd done this in combat zones where anesthesia was a luxury and speed was survival, helping patients into wheelchairs or onto her shoulder if they couldn't walk. Her movements weren't gentle. They were efficient. Gentle was a luxury. Speed was the only mercy available. The smoke thickened. The visibility dropped from 20 feet to 8 feet to 4. The fluorescent lights above buzzed and flickered, creating strobes that made everything feel like a nightmare. Her badge clattered against her sternum as she moved, the metal picking up the acrid heat. 17 patients. That was her count. 17 people who would either evacuate because she coordinated them or stay because protocols were easier than action. She got the first group to stairwell C, 8 patients, 3 nurses, all moving in the darkness that was getting darker by the second. She pointed down. Go. Don't stop. When you hit ground level, move 300 feet from the building and keep moving. They went. Back upstairs. The smoke was above eye level now, pressing down like something physical. She could taste it, that chemical burn that coated the back of her throat with the flavor of melted plastic and burning copper. Room 318 was empty. Room 320 had a patient she recognized, a man named Harrison with a hip fracture, 78 years old, unlikely to move fast. She helped him up. His weight wasn't the problem. The problem was the smoke getting thicker, the hallway getting darker, the fact that the fire was somewhere below them now, cutting off escape routes with every passing second. Put your arm around my shoulders. We move together. Stay low where the air is better. They moved. 1 step. Another. The smoke made every breath feel like swallowing razors. 6 more patients. Her mind was cataloging them like targeting coordinates. 4th floor, south wing, Elena Vasquez, diabetic crisis, conscious, mobile. Room for 04, Marcus Chen, post-surgical, pain level moderate but able to walk. The list continued like a tactical checklist she'd run 1,000 times. Not in a hospital. In Fallujah. In conditions where hesitation meant death and protocol was something the dead worried about. She moved through the building like it was a combat zone because in her body, in her muscle memory, it was exactly that. The walls became obstacles. The smoke became shrapnel. The time was always running out. The medication room door on the 4th floor was locked. Behind it, Whitfield was collapsed on the floor, unconscious from smoke inhalation. He'd been in there looking for something, prescription pads, probably, or documentation that supported his narrative that Margaret was falsifying patient records. He'd locked the door behind him out of pure administrative habit, the kind of compulsive control that felt normal in boardrooms and suicidal in burning buildings. Margaret didn't hesitate. She kicked the door. It held. She kicked again. On the third kick, the deadbolt gave way, not with a crack but with the sound of wood splitting, of hinges yielding to physics and necessity. Whitfield was sprawled on the tile, his face already showing the early signs of hypoxia, his breathing shallow and irregular. She grabbed him under the armpits. He was dead weight, muscle and ego and 200 pounds of unconsciousness. She dragged him toward the stairwell, his heels scraping against tile, her breathing controlled despite the smoke, despite the weight, despite the fact that 6 months ago this man had thrown a patient chart at her feet and smirked. In Fallujah, she'd carried wounded Marines 3 times his weight across open ground while rounds impacted the dirt around her. His weight was nothing. His body was just an obstacle to move. She got him to the stairwell, handed him to Morrison and 2 nurses who were gathering on the landing. Get him down. Keep his airway open. Move. They moved. 17 people. Margaret counted them as they streamed down stairwell C in the darkness that was broken only by emergency lighting that flickered like it was dying. 17 people who would live because she'd been in that building at 0200 hours, because her hands knew what to do when every other voice in the building was paralyzed. 17 people who didn't know that the woman who'd pulled them from burning corridors wasn't just a nurse with a steady hand. They didn't know what she was. What she'd been. What her body still remembered how to do. The fire department declared the building secure at 05 for 5. Dawn was just breaking, turning the sky the color of copper, the color of old blood, the color that always seemed to accompany moments that changed things. All patients accounted for. All staff accounted for. The evacuation had taken 43 minutes. Nobody died. Nobody suffered severe injuries beyond smoke inhalation and the kind of adrenaline shock that would take days to wear off. By the standard of medical emergencies, it was a success. By the standard of the law, Margaret had just performed emergency procedures without authorization, directed staff without credentials to do so, and operated under a chain of command that didn't officially exist. By 0800, Dr. Whitfield had made his calls. His contacts. His network. 3 board members. 2 investigators from the State Nursing Board. A call to Cedar Creek Medical's security team requesting an emergency credential review. His logic was simple: Margaret had overstepped her authority, performed unauthorized medical procedures, taken command of hospital staff without proper licensure or hospital protocols. She was a liability. She was a problem. She was a threat that needed to be eliminated from the building before she could damage his reputation further. He didn't know that her unauthorized procedures had just saved the hospital from a wrongful death lawsuit multiplied by 17. He didn't know that the nurses she'd commanded had already told 3 different people that Margaret Walsh was the reason they were breathing. He didn't know that Commander James Rivera, still in the cardiac unit, was lying in his hospital bed realizing exactly what he'd known the moment he locked eyes with her during the pericardiocentesis 5 hours earlier. Master Chief. Fallujah. The medic who'd held the east corridor for 6 hours straight while rounds came from 3 directions and the only thing standing between his unit and annihilation was her hands, her training, her refusal to accept that any of her people would die on her watch. Margaret sat in the break room at 0830, a cup of coffee cooling in front of her, watching the morning news report on the Cedar Creek fire. All patients safely evacuated thanks to quick-thinking staff, the news anchor said. Her image appeared on the screen for exactly 2 seconds, pale face, smoke-stained scrubs, helping an elderly patient toward the exit. She didn't recognize herself. The woman on that screen looked like a nurse. Which meant she'd been doing the job correctly. Which meant nobody had to know what was underneath. The coffee was room temperature now. She didn't drink it. She just sat there in the fluorescent lighting, listening to the break room refrigerator hum its mechanical song, knowing that her cover had just been blown wide open by the one thing she'd been sent to Cedar Creek to prevent: saving lives. The investigation was already starting. The walls were already closing. In a few hours, the security office would call her name. The monitor flatlined at 0430 hours. Not the slow descent Margaret had been tracking for the past 8 hours. Not the gradual drift of a man whose body was quietly shutting down. This was the sudden electrical silence of acute decompensation, the kind that meant minutes, not hours. The kind that meant now. Commander James Rivera's chest stopped moving. His oxygen saturation had been dropping in small increments all night, something the day shift nurses had charted as stable because they hadn't been watching closely enough. But Margaret had been watching. She'd noticed the subtle shift in his breathing pattern at 2,200 hours. The way his neck veins had started to distend slightly. The muffled heart sounds during rounds at 0300. Classic signs of cardiac tamponade, blood accumulating in the pericardial sac, compressing the heart like a fist slowly closing. The firefighters had left 20 minutes earlier, declaring the structure secure. The electrical fire that had torn through Cedar Creek's basement was contained, smoldering in the walls, the emergency crew satisfied that the building wouldn't collapse. Margaret had pulled 17 people out of that smoke. She'd held Dr. Whitfield's unconscious body across her shoulders and carried him to the stairwell, his face pressed against her neck, dead weight that she'd shouldered without breaking stride. She'd done her job in the dark, in the heat, with the kind of precision that came from muscle memory trained into her body across 2 decades. Now she did her job again. She didn't call for backup. Didn't page cardiology. Didn't waste time waiting for the on-call physician who was somewhere in the hospital trying to process the chaos of the fire evacuation. She moved to Rivera's bedside, gloved her hands with a snap that cut through the fluorescent hum of the cardiac unit, and assessed what she already knew. The man was dying in front of her, his heart compressed by blood, his body drowning from the inside. "I need an 18-gauge needle," she said. Her voice came out flat, professional, the voice of a nurse making a clinical decision. Nobody questioned it. The ICU tech moved without hesitation, placing the needle in her palm. Margaret's hands were already steady, they had held worse than this. They had held men who'd stepped on IEDs in Fallujah. They had held arterial bleeds in makeshift medical tents. They had held Rivera himself, once, 6 years ago, when his platoon had been pinned in the Jolan district and his leg medic had taken shrapnel. She didn't think about that. Couldn't afford to. The second intercostal space, midclavicular line. She palpated the anatomy she knew the way most people knew their own names. The needle went in with the smooth precision of a surgeon placing a suture through silk. There was a moment of resistance, then a give. The hiss of air escaping, that sound like the last breath of something dying, then the sudden rush of blood into the syringe. Dark red, under pressure, the kind of blood that meant his heart had been drowning for hours while everyone else was distracted by smoke and evacuation protocols. 30 milliliters. 40. 50. The monitor beeped once. Then twice. Then the rhythm came back, not perfect, but back. Sinus rhythm, climbing. The electrical activity of a heart that was suddenly free to beat again. Rivera's eyes snapped open mid-procedure. For 1 second, one frozen second in time, his pupils locked onto her hands. Not her face. Her hands. The hands performing the pericardiocentesis with the exact speed and technique taught only to naval special warfare combat medics. His eyes were dark, sharp, despite the morphine she'd pushed before the procedure. Conscious. Aware. Recognizing something in the mechanical precision of her movements the way only a man trained in field medicine would recognize it. His voice came out weak, fractured, barely above a whisper, but the words landed with the weight of recognition, Master Chief. Fallujah. The East Corridor. 6 hours. That was you. Not a question. A statement. A fact he'd just identified through the lens of her hands, through the way she angled the needle, the way her fingers controlled the syringe with the kind of economy of motion that came from operating under fire. She'd held that corridor while the rest of his team extracted wounded. She'd had an 18-gauge needle in her hand then too, applying pressure to bleeding that wouldn't stop, her fingers working while rounds impacted the wall behind her head. Margaret met his eyes for that one frozen second. The ICU tech had moved back. The monitor was beeping its steady rhythm. Rivera's oxygen saturation was climbing, 88, 91, 94. His blood pressure normalizing on the monitor behind him. She brought her finger to her lips. Pressed it there, a single gesture that meant silence. That meant not here. That meant you say nothing, not one word, not to anyone. His eyes held hers for a moment longer. Then he nodded, the smallest movement, just a dip of his chin. Understanding. The recognition of someone who'd lived in the world of classified operations, compartmentalized information, and the necessity of discretion that came from serving in units where names were never used, pasts were never discussed, and identities were only safe when kept buried. She turned back to the monitor. Documented the procedure in clinical terms. Emergency pericardiocentesis performed at 0 for 37 hours for acute cardiac tamponade secondary to traumatic hemorrhage. Patient responded immediately. Vital signs stabilized. No complications noted. Her handwriting was steady on the chart. Professional. Just a nurse doing her job. Rivera's oxygen saturation hit 97. His heart rate dropped to 88. The numbers climbed back into the green zone on the monitors, the vital signs of a man whose body had suddenly remembered how to work again. She set up a continuous pressure monitor to track whether the fluid might reaccumulate, knowing it wouldn't. The bleeding had stopped, the pericardial sac had been decompressed, and now his heart could beat without that crushing weight. She didn't look at him again that night. Didn't need to. She had 17 minutes left before the day's shift arrived, before the hospital fully woke up, before the investigators began their paperwork and the board members started making calls about the nurse with the perfect clinical instincts and the hands that moved like someone had taught her exactly how to save lives under conditions that weren't in any civilian nursing textbook. Rivera dozed as the medication pulled him under. His vital signs remained stable. The danger had passed, at least the medical danger. The other danger, the one that had just recognized her through the lens of her own hands, was only beginning. The walls were already closing. In a few hours, the security office would call her name. By noon, Dr. Whitfield had already made his calls. 3 board members before sunrise. 4 by breakfast. His voice on their private lines was smooth, practiced, the tone of a man accustomed to being believed. "I need to report a serious compliance issue," he'd said to each one. "We have a nurse with fraudulent credentials performing unauthorized procedures during the fire. State investigators need to be contacted immediately." The lies came easily because they were wrapped in just enough truth. She had performed procedures. She had saved lives without authorization. He simply didn't mention that those procedures had prevented 17 deaths, or that every move she'd made followed emergency protocols designed for exactly this scenario. By 0800 hours, the investigation was already in motion. Not because anyone had verified his claims. Because he was Dr. Whitfield, chief of surgery, a man whose connections ran through hospital administration like steel cables through concrete. His power source wasn't his medical degree. It was his institutional position, his network of favor-givers and favor-takers, the 3 board members who owed him for past discretions and weren't about to question his judgment on a staffing matter. Margaret didn't hear about the investigation until 11:45 hours. She was restocking the trauma bay supplies when Janice from HR found her, clipboard in hand, face apologetic in the way people get when they're delivering someone else's bad decision. "Margaret, we need you to come with me to security." No explanation. No preamble. Just the tone that meant the machinery had already started moving. The walk through the corridors felt longer than it should have. 2 minutes that stretched like hours. Her hand stayed steady. Her breathing didn't change. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. She'd learned decades ago that showing reaction was a luxury she couldn't afford. By 11:55 hours, she was in the security office. By 1200 hours, a cardboard box containing her belongings sat on the desk in front of her. Her name badge. Her stethoscope. The laminated ID that had gotten her through the staff entrance for 6 months. Security Chief Morrison was professional about it, the way you are when you're following orders you didn't write. The hospital has received formal notification from state investigators regarding unauthorized medical procedures and credential discrepancies. We're required to suspend your employment effective immediately pending the outcome of their review. Margaret picked up the box. It weighed almost nothing. I understand. Her voice was flat. Not angry. Not defensive. Just flat, the way a surface is flat. You'll need to return your access cards and any hospital property. She'd already placed them on the desk. He didn't meet her eyes. Nobody ever did, in these moments. Because meeting her eyes meant acknowledging that something was wrong with how this was happening, and Morrison's job was not to question things. His job was to follow the script. The rain started before she made it to the parking lot. October in Portland. The kind of rain that doesn't fall so much as manifest, appearing in the air like a decision that's already been made. She sat in her car for 8 minutes before starting the engine, the cardboard box on the passenger seat, that hollow space where her employment ID used to be reflecting the grey light coming through the windshield. 6 months. That's how long she'd been at Cedar Creek Medical. 6 months of monitoring the supply chain, tracking the pharmaceutical technician who'd been diverting controlled substances with such precision that only someone looking for the pattern would see it. 6 months of documenting the network, how those diverted medications moved through distribution channels controlled by a shell company in Delaware, eventually reaching a port facility in Tacoma where they were repackaged for shipment to overseas arms dealers with ties to 3 terrorist organizations the Pentagon had been tracking for 18 months. Her intelligence had been feeding into a larger operation, a task force coordinated through Joint Special Operations Command, and now that thread was severed. The supply chain investigation would have to restart. The pharmacy technician would see her arrest delayed. The overseas connection would have time to scrub their records. Everything dissolved because she'd chosen to save Commander Rivera's life instead of maintaining her cover. Everything dissolved because saving people mattered more than intelligence operations. Everything dissolved because she was a better nurse than she was a spy. The diner on 82nd Avenue was empty at 0300 hours. 3 customers total, a trucker reading a newspaper in the corner booth, a homeless man nursing a cup of coffee he'd been making last for 2 hours, and Margaret, sitting in a window booth with a cup of black coffee that had gone cold 45 minutes ago. Her reflection stared back at her from the dark window. The grey hair pulled into a bun. The lines around her eyes that came from 23 years of looking at broken things and deciding what could be fixed. The hands folded on the table in front of her, hands that had held a SEAL's heart in place, that had guided nurses through a burning building, that had documented a pharmacy technician's supply chain with the precision of someone who understood that evidence had to be bulletproof. She didn't see the nurse she'd pretended to be. The quiet woman who deferred to doctors, who accepted insults without responding, who existed in the margins of Cedar Creek Medical's hierarchy and made no claims on visibility or recognition. She didn't see the Master Chief Petty Officer either. 23 years of active duty. Combat medic designation. Qualified for Tier 1 operations. For tours through Fallujah, Sanjin Valley, Jolin District. 87 combat saves documented. The medical protocol she developed for trauma management now taught across all SEAL teams. That version of herself was locked in a garage under paint cans and weathered wood, in a pair of boots that still held Fallujah dust in the leather creases. She saw the hollow space between them. The person who was neither one thing nor the other. Just a woman drinking cold coffee in a diner at 3 a.m., watching her reflection dissolve in the darkness outside, and feeling the weight of 6 months of investigation collapsing into a cardboard box. The silence was so thick you could operate in it. Outside, the rain drummed against the diner windows like fingers tapping on glass, trying to get in. Trying to remind her that there was still a world out there beyond this moment. But right now, in this empty diner, in this hollow space between identities, the world felt very far away. Her phone buzzed on the table at 0307 hours. A text from an unknown number. Just coordinates. Latitude and longitude. A meeting location. The kind of message that didn't come through normal channels because this wasn't a normal situation anymore. The intelligence operation was compromised, yes. But Margaret Walsh wasn't just an intelligence asset. She was a combat medic who'd spent half her life keeping warriors alive, and Commander James Rivera had recognized her hands during a procedure that should have killed him. Someone in the chain of command knew what she'd done. Someone knew what she was. Someone was about to come looking. The coffee was cold. The diner still hummed with fluorescent silence. The trucker turned a page in his newspaper. The homeless man refilled his cup from the pot the server left at his table. And Margaret Walsh sat in the window booth, her phone in her hand, those two coordinate numbers burning in the dark like a call that couldn't be ignored. The next voice she heard wouldn't be human. It would be a helicopter. If this story's hitting you the way it should, you need to hit that subscribe button right now. Because next segment, everything changes. The military arrives. The truth comes out. And Dr. Whitfield's going to find out that he picked a fight with someone he had no idea existed. Drop a comment, what would you have done in Margaret's position? Walk away or wait for the call. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to see what happens when the quiet person in the room finally gets recognized for what she actually is. Because the truth is darker than any lie Whitfield could have told.